Laugh again after you verify it. Renee Carter said the words without raising her voice, standing beside her dark blue sport utility vehicle as Officer Travis Nolan stared at the federal badge in his hand like it was something bought from a costume shop. 15 minutes earlier, Renee had pulled into a shopping plaza outside Silver Spring, Maryland, expecting nothing more dramatic than a short stop before an interagency meeting. She was 39, dressed in a navy blouse beneath a charcoal coat, carrying a sealed document case that had not left her side all afternoon. Nothing about her appearance announced authority. That was intentional. Renee had spent years learning that real authority did not need to advertise itself. Nolan had approached after receiving a vague report about a vehicle lingering near the rear entrance of a pharmacy. The description had been broad enough to fit dozens of cars in the lot. But once he saw Renee, his questions became strangely specific. Where did she live? Why was she there? Who owned the vehicle? Why was she carrying a locked case? Renee answered each question calmly. She provided her driver's license. Then, when Nolan continued pressing, she identified herself as a senior Federal Bureau of Investigation agent assigned to a joint federal inquiry. Nolan actually smiled. Federal agent, he said. Renee reached slowly into the approved compartment of her bag and presented her credentials. Nolan looked at the badge, then at her face, then back at the badge. His smile widened. You expect me to believe this is real? A few shoppers nearby began watching. Renee felt the familiar sting of being evaluated before the evidence had even been considered. She had experienced doubt before, the extra question, the second look, the subtle change in tone when someone decided her position seemed improbable. But she did not argue. Call the federal verification number, she said. Nolan handed the credentials to his younger partner, Officer Eric Dawson. Dawson examined them carefully. Travis, these look legitimate. Nolan barely glanced at him. Good fakes usually do. Renee kept her hands visible and her posture steady. Then verify them. Nolan's expression hardened. His hand moved toward his holster as he instructed Renee not to move. He did not remove the weapon, but the message was unmistakable. The parking lot seemed to shrink around them. Renee noticed a woman beside a shopping cart stop walking. A delivery driver lowered his phone. Dawson looked increasingly uncomfortable. We can check the credential number from the cruiser, he said. Nolan ignored him. Renee looked directly at Nolan. That is the second opportunity you have had to verify my identity. Something flickered across his face. Annoyance, perhaps, because she was counting. Renee was counting everything. The questions, the interruptions, the refusal to check, and most importantly, the small red light glowing on Nolan's body camera. He thought the camera was documenting her behavior. Renee understood it was documenting his decisions. Turn around and stay where I can see you, Nolan ordered. Renee complied without protest. She could have named senior officials. She could have mentioned the meeting waiting for her less than 5 miles away. She could have told him why the sealed case mattered. Instead, she remained silent. Nolan mistook that silence for surrender. Dawson did not. He stepped closer to the patrol vehicle and entered the credential number into the verification system. A moment later, his expression changed. Travis. Nolan did not look at him. What? Dawson stared at the screen. You need to see this. Renee closed her eyes for half a second. The verification had finally begun. What Nolan still did not know was that her meeting that afternoon involved an investigation connected to complaints from his own precinct. Dawson turned the patrol computer slightly so Nolan could see the result. For the first time since the stop began, Nolan hesitated. The screen did not display a warning or rejection. It showed a federal credential verification request with a confirmation code and instructions to contact an authorized liaison. Dawson read the first line again. The number matches. Nolan glanced at Renee, then back at the screen. Matches what? Her credentials. Dawson lowered his voice. At least enough that we need to make the call. Renee remained beside her vehicle, still facing away as instructed, listening to every word without turning around. She could feel several people watching from across the parking lot. The humiliation had become public now, but she refused to let embarrassment dictate her next move. Nolan had already been given 3 chances to slow down. She wanted the record to show what he did with each one. Officer Nolan, she said evenly, you have verification instructions in front of you. Nolan stepped away from the cruiser. I am still conducting an investigation. Renee turned her head just enough to hear him clearly. Then conduct it correctly. His jaw tightened. You do not give orders here. Dawson looked from Nolan to Renee. Travis, she is right about one thing. We should call. Nolan ignored him again and looked toward the sealed case inside Renee's vehicle. What is in that bag? Official material. That is convenient. Renee said nothing. The question had been expected. The answer had been deliberate. Nolan interpreted her refusal to explain as another reason for suspicion. If you are really federal, you should have no problem telling me what you are carrying. Renee slowly faced him. That is not how protected information works. Nolan laughed once, short and dismissive. Protected information. Federal badge. Secret meeting. You have an answer for everything. Renee studied his expression. He was no longer investigating facts. He was defending the conclusion he had formed before the verification began. Dawson returned to the terminal and dialed the liaison number displayed on the screen. Nolan turned sharply. What are you doing? What the system says. The call connected. Dawson identified himself, provided the credential number, and waited. His posture changed almost immediately. Yes, sir. He listened. Understood. Another pause. She is here now. Nolan stared at him. Renee watched the small red light on his body camera continue blinking. Everything mattered now. Tone. Timing. Instructions. Refusals. The federal liaison said something Dawson did not repeat aloud. Dawson covered the receiver and looked at Nolan. They confirmed her identity. Nolan's expression remained stubborn. Confirmed what exactly? Dawson answered carefully. Senior Special Agent Renee Carter. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Active status. A shopper nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Nolan looked at Renee as if the confirmation itself had offended him. Anybody can get someone on a phone. Dawson stared at him. Travis, this number came from the verification system. Renee felt the moment shift. She had expected disbelief. She had not expected Nolan to continue after official confirmation. That decision changed the situation completely. Officer Nolan, she said. I am asking you one final time to return my credentials and document this stop accurately. Nolan looked toward the case again. Not until we sort out what you are doing here. Renee's voice became quieter. You are now knowingly interfering with a verified federal agent conducting official business. Dawson's face tightened. Nolan took a breath, then made the decision Renee had been waiting for without realizing she was waiting for it. We will sort it out at the station. Renee did not argue. She simply looked at Dawson. Make sure both body cameras stay active. Nolan gave another dismissive smile. Still worried about your evidence? Renee met his eyes. No, Officer Nolan. I am worried about yours. The drive to the station took less than 10 minutes, but Renee Carter used every second of it. She sat in the back of the patrol vehicle with her hands resting calmly in her lap, watching the afternoon light move across storefront windows as Silver Spring traffic passed outside. Officer Eric Dawson drove. Officer Travis Nolan sat in the passenger seat, speaking into the radio in a clipped voice that made the situation sound far more uncertain than it really was. Possible credential issue involving a subject claiming federal status, he said. Dawson glanced at him, but did not correct the wording. Renee noticed that too. The verification had already happened. Her identity had been confirmed. Yet Nolan was still describing her as someone making a claim. That difference would matter later. Officer Dawson, Renee said, did the federal liaison confirm my credentials? Dawson kept his eyes on the road. Yes, ma'am. Nolan turned slightly in his seat. Do not start building your own report from back there. Renee looked at the blinking red light on his body camera. I am not building anything. You are. Nolan faced forward again. The station came into view a minute later, a low brick building with a row of marked cruisers beneath gray afternoon clouds. Renee had been there once before, 6 weeks earlier, but nobody in the patrol division knew that. She had entered through a side conference entrance during a sealed interagency briefing connected to complaints involving evidence handling, selective enforcement, and inaccurate incident reports. Nolan had no idea the woman he was bringing inside as a problem had already seen his precinct listed on a federal case summary. Dawson parked near the intake entrance. When Renee stepped out, 2 officers near the doorway looked toward her, then toward Nolan. She felt the same quiet judgment she had experienced in the parking lot, the assumption that if she arrived in the back of a police vehicle, the story must already be understood. Renee said nothing. Silence protected facts from becoming theater. Inside, fluorescent lights reflected off pale tile floors. Captain Susan Whitmore emerged from a hallway carrying a tablet. What do we have? Nolan answered immediately. Possible impersonation, suspicious vehicle activity, questionable federal credentials, and an unsecured case she refuses to explain. Dawson's expression tightened. Whitmore looked at him. Questionable credentials? Before Dawson could answer, Renee spoke. My credentials were verified through the liaison number provided by your own system. Whitmore turned toward Nolan. Were they confirmed? Nolan hesitated. 1 second. 2. A person on the phone said they were. Dawson finally stepped in. Captain, the number came directly from the federal verification return. They confirmed her full name, active status, and title. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Then why is she here? The room became very still. Nolan looked toward Renee as though she had created the problem by surviving his explanation. Because the circumstances are still suspicious. Whitmore glanced at the sealed document case, then back at Renee. Agent Carter, is that case connected to official business? Yes. Can you disclose its contents? Not in an open intake area. Whitmore nodded immediately. The contrast was almost painful in its simplicity. One question, one professional answer. No mockery, no performance. Nolan noticed it too. Renee could see frustration gathering behind his expression. Whitmore motioned toward a private interview room. We will verify everything again and clear this up. Renee did not move yet. Captain, before we do, I need confirmation that all body camera footage, dispatch audio, terminal searches, and intake recordings connected to this encounter will be preserved. Nolan laughed under his breath. There she goes again. Whitmore looked at him. Officer Nolan, stop talking. The words were quiet, but they ended the room. Renee stepped into the interview room and placed the sealed case on the table beside her. Through the glass, she watched Whitmore pull Dawson aside. Nolan remained near the desk, arms folded, still wearing the expression of someone convinced that persistence would eventually turn suspicion into proof. Then Whitmore's tablet vibrated. She read the incoming message once, then again. Her posture changed. Dawson leaned closer. Nolan noticed. What is it? Whitmore did not answer immediately. She looked through the glass at Renee, then back at the screen. The message had come from the Interagency Task Force office. It confirmed Renee's credentials, but that was not what made Whitmore go pale. Beneath the confirmation was a second line. Special Agent Carter was scheduled to brief this command today regarding an active review of officer conduct. Renee watched Whitmore slowly lift her eyes toward Nolan. The investigation he thought he had brought into the station had already been waiting for him there. Captain Susan Whitmore kept her eyes on the message for several seconds before locking the tablet screen and looking toward Travis Nolan. The change in her expression was subtle, but everyone in the intake area felt it. Nolan straightened. Captain. Whitmore did not answer him immediately. Instead, she turned to Eric Dawson. Take Officer Nolan to conference room 2. Do not discuss the stop with anyone else. Nolan frowned. What for? Whitmore's voice stayed controlled. Because I need the facts separated before this becomes more complicated than it already is. Renee watched through the interview room glass as Nolan's confidence shifted into irritation. He had expected the station to validate his decisions. Instead, the building itself seemed to be closing around them with procedure. Dawson motioned toward the hallway. Nolan remained where he was. She was acting suspicious. I made a judgment call. Whitmore looked directly at him. Your judgment call continued after federal verification. Nolan opened his mouth, then stopped. Renee could almost hear the silence tightening around that fact. Whitmore entered the interview room and closed the door behind her. Agent Carter, I owe you an apology for what happened outside this station. Renee shook her head once. I am not here for an apology, Captain. Whitmore glanced at the sealed case. You were scheduled to brief command today? Yes. About officer conduct? Renee paused. She had no intention of revealing more than necessary until the evidence chain was secure. About a pattern of complaints involving selective stops, documentation irregularities, and verification failures. Whitmore understood immediately. Does Nolan's name appear in that review? Renee held her gaze. That is one of the reasons I asked you to preserve everything. Whitmore exhaled slowly and reached for the station phone. Then preservation starts now. Within minutes, dispatch recordings were flagged, body camera uploads were locked, and the patrol computer search history was copied into an evidence hold. Renee remained seated, watching the process unfold without directing it. She wanted the department to own its next decisions. In conference room 2, Nolan continued insisting that the stop had been reasonable. Dawson sat across from him, quieter than before. "You saw the verification," Nolan said. "You also saw the locked case." Dawson looked at him. "I saw both. I also heard her ask us 3 times to verify who she was." Nolan leaned back. "And?" Dawson's expression hardened slightly. "And you did not want the answer." The sentence landed differently than anything Renee could have said. Nolan stared at him. "You taking her side now?" "I am taking the side of what happened." Back in the interview room, Whitmore received another call. This one came from Assistant Special Agent in charge Michael Grant. She placed it on speaker after identifying herself. Grant's voice was calm and precise. "Captain Whitmore, Agent Carter was transporting protected material for a scheduled joint review. Her credentials are fully confirmed. I also need to inform you that today's encounter may fall within the scope of that review." Whitmore glanced toward Renee. "Understood." Grant continued. "Do not access her sealed case. Preserve all recordings. Internal Affairs has been notified." Renee watched Whitmore's posture stiffen. "How soon?" "They are already on the way." Outside the room, Nolan appeared through the glass, standing near the hallway entrance after Dawson had stepped away. He could not hear the call, but he saw Whitmore's face. He saw Renee sitting calmly at the table. He saw the sealed case still untouched beside her. Something finally began to register. He had spent the afternoon treating Renee's badge as the questionable object. Now every system around him was treating his decisions as the evidence. Whitmore ended the call and looked at Renee. "Agent Carter, there is something you should know before Internal Affairs arrives." Renee waited. Whitmore opened a secure personnel file on the tablet and turned it around. "Officer Nolan has 3 prior complaints involving disputed identification stops. 2 were closed. 1 is still under administrative review." Renee looked down at the dates. 1 matched a case already sitting inside the sealed folder beside her. She raised her eyes. "Captain, do not tell him that yet." Whitmore studied her. "Why?" Renee's expression remained unreadable. "Because I want to hear how he explains today before he knows yesterday is already in the room." Internal Affairs arrived 20 minutes later, 2 investigators in plain clothes carrying tablets, evidence forms, and the kind of controlled expressions that made the station feel even quieter. Renee Carter remained in the interview room, while Captain Susan Whitmore briefed them on the stop, the credential verification, the protected case, and the prior complaints connected to Travis Nolan. Nobody rushed. Nobody needed to. The sequence was already preserved in body camera footage, dispatch audio, computer logs, and the testimony of Eric Dawson. Nolan was brought into a separate room and asked to describe the encounter from the beginning. He started confidently. A suspicious vehicle. An uncooperative subject. Questionable credentials. A locked case. 1 investigator stopped him. "At what point did Officer Dawson confirm the federal credential number?" Nolan paused. "During the stop." "Before or after you decided to transport Agent Carter?" Another pause. "Before." The investigator entered something on the tablet. "And after confirmation, what specific new fact gave you reason to continue?" Nolan leaned back. "Her behavior remained suspicious." "Describe the behavior." Nolan searched for an answer that sounded objective. "She was guarded. She would not explain the case. She kept challenging the stop." The investigator looked up. "Did she refuse identification?" "No." "Did she threaten you?" "No." "Did she attempt to leave?" "No." "Did she comply with your instructions?" Nolan's jaw tightened. "Yes." The room became still. Outside, Dawson sat with the second investigator and gave his own account. He described Renee's calm answers, the credential check, the liaison call, and Nolan's refusal to accept confirmation. When asked whether Renee had done anything that made him believe she was impersonating a federal agent, Dawson shook his head. "No. Once the system matched her credentials, I thought the stop should have ended." The investigator asked, "Did you tell Officer Nolan that?" Dawson looked down for a moment. "Yes." "More than once?" "Yes." Across the hall, Renee finally opened the sealed document case in Whitmore's presence. Inside were summaries of several disputed stops from the precinct, including one involving a black woman named Denise Parker, a hospital administrator who had been detained after Nolan questioned whether the vehicle registration in her name was legitimate. Renee laid the file on the table. This is the case I was scheduled to discuss today. Whitmore read the summary carefully. The body camera review from that incident showed the same pattern. Valid identification. Immediate doubt. Delayed verification. Language in the written report that made the citizens sound evasive even though the video showed consistent answers. Whitmore's expression changed. His report says she refused to cooperate. Renee pointed to the transcript. She answered every direct question. Whitmore read another line. He wrote that she became increasingly confrontational. Renee looked at her. Watch the footage. They did. The woman remained composed throughout. No shouting. No threats. No refusal. Just growing frustration as the same questions were repeated. Whitmore closed her eyes briefly. This is not a wording problem. Renee shook her head. No. The second investigator entered with another tablet. Captain, we compared today's preliminary incident notes with the body camera footage. Whitmore turned toward him. And Officer Nolan documented that Agent Carter resisted verification and refused to identify herself clearly. Renee said nothing. Whitmore looked toward the hallway where Nolan sat waiting. That is not what happened. The investigator nodded. We know. He placed the tablet on the table. There is more. 2 prior complaints show similar discrepancies between his written reports and recorded encounters. Renee felt the story widening exactly as she had feared. This was no longer about whether Nolan had treated her unfairly in a parking lot. It was about whether he had been using official reports to make questionable decisions look reasonable after the fact. Whitmore stood. What happens now? The investigator answered carefully. He is being placed on administrative suspension pending a formal review. His access to department systems will be restricted immediately. Renee looked through the glass as Nolan was informed. For the first time all afternoon, his face lost its defensive certainty. He looked toward Renee, and she met his eyes without satisfaction. The badge he had laughed at was not what had changed the balance of power. The recordings had. The logs had. His own words had. And somewhere beneath all of that sat a harder question Nolan could no longer avoid. How many people had been forced to carry the weight of his assumptions before anyone thought to compare his version of events with the truth? The suspension notice changed the atmosphere of the precinct immediately, but Renee Carter knew the real work had only started. Travis Nolan was escorted to a private office where his department credentials, access card, and assigned equipment were documented for temporary surrender while internal affairs prepared the next stage of the review. There was no spectacle, no raised voices, no satisfaction in the room, just procedure catching up with decisions that had been allowed to stand for too long. Eric Dawson remained near the intake desk, visibly shaken by how quickly the afternoon had shifted. He had started the day believing he was assisting a routine stop. Now he was being asked to explain why he had recognized the problem and still followed Nolan back to the station. I told him to verify her, Dawson said during his second statement. The investigator nodded. You did. Dawson looked down. But I still drove. That answer mattered. Renee heard about it later from Captain Susan Whitmore, and she understood the weight behind it. Systems did not fail only because one person made a bad decision. Sometimes they failed because everyone nearby treated discomfort as somebody else's responsibility. Whitmore asked Renee to remain for a formal debrief, and together they began comparing Nolan's recent reports with preserved recordings. The pattern grew clearer with every file. In one stop, a black business owner had produced valid registration, but Nolan's report described him as evasive before verification was complete. In another, a black college student had repeatedly answered questions that the written summary later characterized as refusal to cooperate. The language changed from case to case, but the structure did not. Suspicion came first. Verification came later. The report then made the original suspicion look justified. Renee sat back from the screen. That is how bad judgment becomes a record, she said. Whitmore nodded slowly. And once it is in the record, the next officer reads it as fact. The door opened, and one of the internal affairs investigators entered carrying a printed document. We found something else. Whitmore took the page. It was an amended report from a stop 18 months earlier. The original version had listed no refusal, no threat, and no attempt to flee. The amended version, submitted hours later under Nolan's credentials, added language describing the driver as increasingly non-compliant. Renee studied the timestamps. Was the body camera available when he amended this? The investigator nodded. Yes. Whitmore looked toward the hallway. So he had access to the recording before changing the report. Nobody spoke for a moment. That detail pushed the review into a different category. A careless description could be defended as memory. A later alteration made after recorded evidence existed demanded a harder explanation. Nolan was brought back in and shown the discrepancy. His face tightened. I clarified the report. The investigator asked, why does the clarification add conduct that does not appear in the video? Nolan leaned forward. Because cameras do not capture everything. Renee remained behind the observation glass, listening. The investigator did not argue. Then tell us what happened off camera. Nolan hesitated. I do not remember every detail from 18 months ago. The silence after that answer was longer than the question. Whitmore turned toward Renee. That is the case from your folder, is it not? Renee nodded. One of them. The investigator stepped out and spoke quietly with Whitmore. The amended report had already been referred for legal review because it might involve knowingly false official documentation. Nolan's administrative suspension was no longer the only issue under consideration. Renee looked through the glass at him. Earlier, he had laughed because he thought her badge was fake. Now the question was whether his own paperwork could be trusted. Minutes later, another internal affairs supervisor arrived with 2 department officials. Nolan was informed that a separate inquiry had been opened into possible falsification of an official report. His expression changed completely. Renee did not smile. She had not wanted a reversal built on humiliation. She wanted facts to survive long enough to matter. As Nolan stood to leave the interview room under formal administrative direction, he looked through the glass and saw her. This time there was no laughter in his face. Only the realization that the authority he had treated as personal power was now being measured against the record he created himself. By early evening, the precinct had stopped treating Travis Nolan's case as an internal personnel matter. The amended report from 18 months earlier had been forwarded to the county prosecutor's public integrity unit, along with the original body camera footage, system timestamps, and the audit trail showing when the language had been changed. Renee Carter remained in a secure conference room with Captain Susan Whitmore and 2 investigators while the evidence was reviewed line by line. Nobody wanted speed to replace accuracy. If Nolan had knowingly altered an official report, the consequences had to come from proof, not from the embarrassment of what had happened to Renee that afternoon. Assistant Special Agent in charge Michael Grant arrived shortly after 6 o'clock and placed a thin federal folder beside Renee's sealed case. We found a connection, he said. Whitmore looked up. Grant opened the folder. A prior complaint involving Nolan had been submitted by a black federal contractor who said his government identification had been dismissed during a traffic stop. Nolan's report described the credential as unverifiable. Federal records showed that confirmation had actually been provided 12 minutes before the detention ended. Renee read the timestamp twice. Was that discrepancy ever reviewed? Whitmore shook her head. The complaint was closed as a communication error. Grant looked toward the observation window. That explanation is being reopened. Across the hall, Nolan sat alone, no longer arguing with anyone. The confidence that had followed him from the shopping plaza was gone. What remained was the growing realization that every decision he once considered finished could now be compared against an independent record. Dawson entered the conference room after completing another statement. There is something I need to add, he said. Whitmore motioned for him to continue. Dawson explained that Nolan had once advised younger officers to write reports around what they could justify later rather than what they could confirm immediately. I thought he meant be thorough, Dawson said. Now I am not sure. Renee did not react. One troubling comment was not proof of misconduct, but patterns gained meaning when separate pieces began pointing in the same direction. At 6:37, Whitmore received a call from the county prosecutor. She listened without interruption, asked 2 short questions, then ended the call. They have reviewed the amended report and the supporting video, she said. A judge has authorized a warrant related to suspected falsification of an official record. The room became quiet. Renee looked toward Nolan through the glass. This was the moment the title of the afternoon seemed to reverse itself completely, but she felt no triumph. Minutes later, 2 investigators entered Nolan's room and explained the warrant. His face went pale. You are arresting me over paperwork? He asked. One investigator answered evenly. You are being arrested based on allegations that an official report was knowingly falsified. You will have the opportunity to respond through the legal process. Nolan looked through the glass toward Renee as the investigator placed him in handcuffs according to standard procedure. Earlier, he had treated her badge like a joke. Now his own badge had been removed from his shirt and sealed into an evidence envelope. Their eyes met for several seconds. Nolan seemed to expect anger, perhaps satisfaction, perhaps the same humiliation he had tried to place on her. Renee gave him none of it. When he was escorted toward the hallway, he stopped. "Agent Carter." Renee waited. "Did you come here today looking for me?" She shook her head. "No." That answer seemed to hurt more than accusation. "You were not the target," she continued. "You became evidence because of the choices you made after you had every chance to verify the truth." Nolan lowered his eyes. Renee looked toward the body camera dock across the room, where the afternoon's footage had already been secured. The reversal had not happened because she carried a federal badge. It happened because the record finally refused to bend around somebody else's version of events. The next morning, Renee Carter returned to the precinct under circumstances that felt entirely different from the day before. She entered through the front doors carrying the same sealed document case, but there was no patrol officer questioning why she belonged there. Captain Susan Whitmore met her near the conference room and handed her a fresh evidence summary prepared overnight. Travis Nolan had been processed on the warrant and released according to standard procedure pending his first court appearance. His arrest had not ended the investigation. It had widened it. Internal Affairs had identified 4 additional reports requiring immediate review, each involving disputed identification, delayed verification, or language that appeared stronger on paper than on recorded footage. Renee sat down beside Assistant Special Agent in Charge Michael Grant as the first file appeared on the screen. The driver in that case was a black nurse returning from an overnight hospital shift. She had produced her license and registration within minutes. Yet Nolan's report described her as evasive and unwilling to cooperate. The recording told another story. She answered calmly. She repeated herself when asked. She waited while Nolan questioned whether the vehicle belonged to her despite valid registration. Renee watched without speaking. The details were painfully familiar. Grant looked toward Whitmore. "How many of these complaints were formally sustained?" "None," Whitmore said. "Most were closed individually." Renee leaned back. "That is the problem with looking at each incident alone." Whitmore nodded. "A pattern can hide inside separate paperwork." Eric Dawson entered carrying his own written statement. He looked tired, but more certain than he had the day before. "I reviewed some of my stops with Nolan," he said. "There were times I should have challenged him earlier." Renee looked at him. "What are you going to do with that now?" Dawson considered the question. "Stop treating another officer's confidence like proof." Renee gave a small nod. It was not absolution. It was a beginning. By noon, the county prosecutor requested preservation of all reports authored or amended by Nolan during the previous 3 years. The department also announced an independent audit of complaint handling, supervisory review, and credential verification procedures. Whitmore read the notice twice before placing it on the table. "This is going to make people angry," Grant replied. "Good policy usually makes somebody uncomfortable before it makes anyone safer." Renee looked toward the window where patrol cars moved in and out of the lot. She thought about the moment Nolan had laughed at her credentials, then about the people in the files who had never carried a federal badge strong enough to force immediate attention. That was the part she could not forget. Her own authority had accelerated the response, but it had not made her experience more important than theirs. Later that afternoon, Whitmore received a secure call from the prosecutor's office. New digital evidence showed Nolan had altered another report after watching the corresponding body camera footage. The wording changed from uncertain behavior to deliberate noncompliance, even though the recording did not support the stronger description. Whitmore ended the call slowly. "They are considering additional charges." Renee did not react with satisfaction. She closed the file in front of her. "Then let the evidence decide." Grant looked at her. "You realize this whole review may become public?" Renee nodded. "It probably should." Outside the conference room, Dawson stood beside the body camera docking station, watching officers upload footage at the end of shift. For years, those small red lights had been treated as routine equipment. Now everyone in the building understood what they could become when memory, authority, and written reports disagreed. Whitmore turned toward Renee. "What do you want from this department when the investigation is over?" Renee answered without hesitation. "I I want the next person who shows valid identification to be believed by the process before they have to be important enough to be believed by the officer. 6 months later, the precinct no longer looked the same to the people who worked inside it, even though the walls, desks, and patrol cars had barely changed. The difference lived in procedure. Every disputed identification stop now required documented verification before escalation. Supervisors reviewed body camera footage when written reports described resistance, refusal, or suspicious conduct. Complaints that once disappeared into separate folders were tracked for recurring patterns instead of being judged in isolation. Captain Susan Whitmore had pushed the reforms through despite resistance from officers who believed the department was being punished for one man's mistakes. She reminded them that the review had never been about one man. It had been about everything that allowed his decisions to survive unquestioned. Travis Nolan's case continued through the courts, where prosecutors relied on timestamps, recordings, amended reports, and digital audit records rather than public anger. Some allegations were still being contested, while others had already resulted in formal disciplinary findings that ended his patrol career. Renee Carter followed the process from a distance. She never asked for special treatment and never attended a hearing unless her testimony was required. What mattered to her was not watching Nolan fall. It was watching the system become harder to bend. Eric Dawson remained with the department after completing additional training and participating in the independent review. One evening, near the end of a long shift, he stopped a black woman whose vehicle matched a broad description connected to a reported property incident. She was nervous when he approached. Dawson noticed it immediately. Months earlier, he might have treated that nervousness as evidence. This time, he asked for identification, checked the information, compared the vehicle details, and listened before reaching a conclusion. Within minutes, dispatch confirmed that her car was not connected to the report. Dawson returned her license. "Thank you for your patience, ma'am. You are free to go." The woman looked surprised. "That is it." Dawson nodded. "That is it." She drove away without ever knowing Renee's name, Nolan's history, or the investigation that had changed the department's rules. She only knew that she had been questioned and treated according to facts instead of assumptions. When Whitmore reviewed the routine footage days later, she paused at the end. Nothing dramatic had happened. That was exactly why it mattered. Across town, Renee sat in a quiet federal office finishing the final memorandum connected to the interagency review. On her desk rested the same federal badge Nolan had once laughed at. She looked at it for a moment before closing the case file. The badge had proven her identity that afternoon, but it had never been the most important evidence. The body cameras had mattered more. The reports had mattered more. The people whose complaints had once been dismissed had mattered most of all. Assistant Special Agent in charge Michael Grant stopped at her doorway. "You ready to close it?" Renee looked at the final page. "Yes." She signed the memorandum and handed it to him. Later, driving home through Maryland traffic, Renee passed the shopping plaza where the encounter had begun. She did not stop. She did not need to. The place held no victory for her, only a reminder. Nolan's greatest mistake had not been laughing at the wrong badge. It had been believing that dignity became real only after authority confirmed it. Renee had spent years carrying credentials powerful enough to open secure doors, but the lesson left by that afternoon was simpler than any title she held. Justice did not begin when someone important proved who they were. It began when nobody had to prove they were important before being treated like a human being.